and get started because we have a nice big meeting devoted to one topic, one of my favorite topics, criteria, and so but sometimes I get so excited about these meetings that I don't go around and do the introductions. So why don't we do it this time? And so if you so I'm thinking, should I have people raise their hands or just do it? Yeah, why don't you raise your hands, because that way they'll give me an order to things and I won't lose track. So raise your hand if you want to introduce yourself, and I'll go around and let you just introduce yourself quickly.
And just a quick reminder, folks, if you go to the participants window, you can find that at the bottom of your screen. And click on that, you will see the raise hand function in the lower right-hand corner of that screen. If you are calling in, you can press *9 to raise your hand.
First up is Franny.
Hi, it's Franny Osmond, and later I'm going to be calling in, so I won't always be visible. And it's nice to see you all. And I'm chair of the Transportation Advisory Committee and other local boards, like on the Lowell Regional Transit Authority, etc.
Thanks, Franny. Next up is John.
Well, yeah, no, I think that it could be.
John.
John McQueen, Walk Boston.
Next up is Andrew.
If they because.
So my name is Andy Rieker. I'm at the City of Cambridge. I'm a transit planner in the Community Development Department. Happy to be joining you all. I'm actually going to be on the other side of the screen running a meeting later tonight. So I'm going to be looking to take notes and tips on how to run an effective meeting from Len and from Matt today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'll be happy to help out as much as I can. And next up is Fred.
So that would be. Those Tapas Independent.
Easy.
I mean, I think they had a lot of.
Okay. It didn't come through completely clearly, at least from on my end, Fred. Maybe do it again, please.
Sure. Yes. Fred Mosley. I'm representing ACEC.
Thank you, Fred.
And so, like, it's. I wasn't. Yeah, that was still the thing.
Next up, Laura.
Laura Weiner, transportation planner for the town of Watertown.
Basically, a law.
Thank you, Laura. And so we have some other people that didn't raise their hands, and I'm just going to assume for whatever reason you don't want to introduce yourself, and that's quite all right. And so we're just going to launch into the meeting now. The main topic, as I said, is a discussion about criteria revision for the TIP with Betsy Harvey, who is the Transportation Equity Program Manager for the NPO. So with this, Betsy's up.
Thanks, Len. I thank you guys for having me too. This is really exciting, and this is kind of one of my favorite topics to talk about, how we can more directly, in a very immediate way, in the context of transportation anyway, really affect the transportation projects that we build and how they impact equity populations and can address kind of the current inequities that we know exist currently in the transportation system. So with that, I'm going to we have a really in-depth discussion today, so feel free to we have a lot of time, so if you have questions and suggestions, feel free to ask away at the end of the meeting, and if we miss any, we'll certainly circle back and make sure that they're addressed later on. So over the past several months, us staff at the MPO have been working on developing revised project evaluation criteria from the TIP. I'm going to talk about how we propose to evaluate equity in the TIP criteria. And I realize that this may be the first time that some of you have seen the proposed revisions. And so Matt Genova, our TIP program manager, is also here in case there are questions about specific criteria that I can't answer, and he can certainly do so. So I'm going to start by kind of framing the conversation by talking through our equity goals and objectives that we've set as an MPO, developed through the Long Range Transportation Plan last year, called Destination 2040. And then I'll briefly describe what our current equity scoring proposals are and what the new proposed equity scoring proposal is. And we'll talk about in the context of 3 of the goal areas, which I'll kind of get to in a moment, that Matt has had an opportunity to discuss with the MPO so far. Those are safety, clean air and sustainable communities, and system preservation and modernization. There are 2 other goal areas, just so you know, that are still to be presented to the MPO, so we don't have as detailed kind of revisions to those at this point. And I'll wrap up with a description of the application of our scoring proposal. So I want to start by giving some background on our equity goal area and who we consider equity populations in the context of transportation planning. So in the last long-range plan, the MPO established 6 goal areas, and those are safety, system preservation, and modernization, capacity management and mobility, clean air and sustainable communities, transportation equity, and economic vitality. And in the current TIP, project selection criteria are grouped into each goal area. And the image on the screen shows the current maximum number of points available to projects in each goal area. So safety has a maximum 30 points available to projects. System preservation and modernization and capacity management and mobility each have 29 points available. Economic vitality has 18. Clean air and sustainable communities has 16, and transportation equity has 12. So not only are we revising the criteria within each of those goal areas, but also the points available for each one, and that's how heavily weighted each goal area is relative to the others. And the weighting reflects the MPO's priorities and what members think are the most important impacts or projects to address. We're going to be starting to rescore projects in a few weeks using the new and the revised criteria. And at that point, we'll also start to have more detailed discussions with you and the MPO about this weighting scheme and whether we should be changing it in any way. So these are the equity populations that are currently evaluated within the equity goal area. Those are minority population, the low-income population, people with limited English proficiency, the elderly population, people with disabilities, and carless households. We propose making a few changes to those population groups. We would like to get rid of the carless household population and add the youth population, because carless households are not a protected class under federal civil rights laws and protections, while age is a protected class. And we also want to change how we measure the low-income population. Currently, it's based on household income. We want to change it to be based on poverty status because we think it will align more closely with federal guidance, as well as enable us to count the actual number of people rather than households who are considered low income. So our goal area from Destination 2040 was revised to state that we want to ensure that all people receive comparable benefits from and are not disproportionately burdened by MPO investments, regardless of their race, color, national origin, age, income, ability, or sex. And we wanted to make those changes in part because it would rightly refocus our approach to equity on impacts of investments on those populations. And that's really where our starting point began when we started talking about and thinking about what the criteria should be revised to look like for equity. And in support of that goal, we also established several equity objectives, as you can see on the screen, those being to prioritize MPO investments that benefit equity populations, minimizing potential harmful environmental health and safety effects of MPO projects, promoting investments that support transportation for all ages, and promoting investments that are accessible to all people regardless of ability. And again, so these really focus on impacts rather than proximity, as a lot of times equity evaluations tend to do, and as we had done in the past. And again, is our starting point for digging deeper into, well, what should our criteria be, and acknowledging that they should reflect as well the goals and objectives that we had set for ourselves around equity. So I want to briefly just go over what our current scoring criteria are and some of the drawbacks, and that will help you kind of see, I think, why we decided on the equity scoring proposals that we have decided on.
I'm sorry, Betsy, I'm going to interrupt because I see Andrew Rieger's hand up. Yep. So I'm going to unmute Andrew, see if he has a question.
Just one quick question for clarification. The regional kind of metrics that you're using, I just was, I think, probably reading through the list, and then I realized that there was a point about ability or disability. Is that something that's measured on a population or around the region when you're taking a look kind of more geographically at the data to kind of figure out these populations?
Yeah, so all of the data that we get on the equity populations are derived from the American Community Survey, which is a product of the Census Bureau or the decennial census itself. And disability data is derived from the American Community Survey, and that's how we identify which populations kind of fall in, how many people fall into that category as identifying as having a disability. Now, all that data is self-reported, so there's always a certain amount of uncertainty or error involved with it, but it's a good estimate, and it's the best estimate as we have to understand how many people, what kind of disabilities they may have, and kind of how those folks are distributed in terms of where they live in the region. And I'll actually get more into that information a little bit later and showing like where people with disabilities and other equity populations are distributed. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just so you know, folks, if you want to raise your hand, use the raise hand feature on Zoom, because I'm not looking at video of everyone just to save real estate so I can look at the presentation. So if you are unable to do that, just use the chat function and Matt can help you figure out how to do that. Thank you. Actually, here's a question coming in from John.
In which we get counts.
There you go.
There we go. Betsy, thank you. Just a quick question regarding the, there's a lot of by the way, there's a lot of background noise that somebody's mic is getting.
Maybe it might be my fan. I turned it off.
No, it was chatter. Oh. But anyway, in terms of those inputs for, let's say, disabilities or income, how fine grain do they get, and really what are the inputs used for determining those? I mean, does it go down to zip code? Does it get finer grain than that, or what?
It goes down to block group level. If you're familiar with the census, they divide their data into different geographies. You can get it at state level, you can get it at municipal, county. There's all sorts of weird ones that we don't really worry about, like congressional districts. But also all the way down to what we feel comfortable using as the block group, because the smaller you get, the more, the less accurate it is, generally speaking, except for the decennial census, because that is an actual count of people. But not all of our data is in the decennial census. If you took the survey from the Census Bureau this spring, you'll have noticed that it only asks for age, race, ethnicity, I think maybe a number of people in your household. It's not a lot of data, but so we get the rest of our data from, like I said, like disability data from the American Community Survey, which is an estimate of people, which is less accurate. Yep.
What about income?
That's also from the American Community Survey.
Okay.
So because it's only surveying a certain proportion of the population, I don't know the percent, but it's not a huge amount. They're estimating, like, based on that distribution, what is the likely characteristics of the entire population in the state or the community. So to answer your question more directly, we try not to get too small, but in order to avoid too much uncertainty in the data, but block groups are pretty typical, and they're about the size of a couple of blocks. I mean, that's kind of where the name came from, a couple of city blocks.
In terms of the survey, is their sample size reflective of the population concentrations in these areas in terms of, percentages?
Yes.
Of the sample?
Yep, so they definitely try to get more, they oversample places like Boston, and there's a lot of difficulty. There's a whole literature and very interesting information about proper sampling for different types of areas. So like they oversample in cities because they know that the response rate is lower. In certain communities, they know they have to oversample.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions this time?
That seems to be it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and I can pause after each section to see if there are any questions to break up the conversation.
I'm sorry, I do see that we actually have a question from Franny, I believe. Sorry, Len.
Hi. Hold on. I just have to stop a noise here. I just want. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to something. Okay. My question I put into the chat, and it was when I always thought about proximity to the project. I'm always concerned that it's not necessarily the people who live near the project, but people who will benefit from or use the project. And how do you make sure to happen rather than just based on who lives right next to the project?
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I'm going to get more into that with the proposal, but briefly, that is exactly, I think, what we should be doing as transportation planners. It's the difficulty is not so much do we want to do it, it's more how do we do it and getting the tools to be able to do so. But I'll get more into that later in the presentation. Thanks, Franny.
Sources of variation.
So real quickly, the current scoring approach is actually based on proximity to projects. So we score projects based on how many people are in each of the 6 of those equity demographic groups within the project area. So the more that live in a project area, the more points the project would get, up to a maximum of 12 points total for the equity goal area. There are several drawbacks to this approach. One is that projects with a high share of equity populations that is just below the regional average can't get points. It's set up in a way that to even qualify for points, you have the population, for example, the low-income population in the project area has to exceed the average for the region. And a lot of projects just don't exceed that. A second drawback is that proximity to a project does not mean people will benefit from it or be able to use it. And the criteria don't really directly support the MPO's equity goal and objectives that focus heavily on identifying and addressing impacts to equity populations. And finally, there's a very vague criteria for identifying burdens. There's a -10 that a project can get if there is a quote unquote burden to an equity population, but it doesn't describe how to define what a burden is, at what point is something considered a burden. So it's very much up to the scorer to decide if something is a burden. So we want to change that. So with that, I want to talk about how new scoring proposal we've come up with to help address those issues and really strengthen our criteria. So when we started thinking about what goals the new criteria should accomplish, we came up with 4 guiding principles. First of all, the criteria needs to meet federal guidance regarding how equity populations are identified. So some of those changes that I mentioned earlier about changing how we measure the low-income population, as well as adding the youth population and getting rid of carless households, help us to better be in line with federal guidance. Our second guiding principle was that the criteria needed to help the MPO meet our equity goal and objectives, as I've stated before. And then thirdly, we want to award progressively more points to projects that are based on the share of the equity populations it would benefit. get rid of the population minimum that there currently exists. There's a minimum population of 200 that is required in the project area in order for a project to qualify for getting points. And then finally, as I think I've already kind of hammered home, is that we want to assess impacts to equity populations rather than the proximity of the project. So to help us develop these new criteria for both equity and all of our other goal areas, we undertook some public outreach last fall and winter to get input on which criteria are most important. I'm going to focus largely on the equity component of that input, but certainly feel free to ask questions about any of the feedback that we received and try to answer those. So the in-person outreach consisted of 7 focus groups, 6 of which focused on equity populations, and we provided interpreter service in Spanish as we needed. And we had a total of 93 people attend the focus group. And we asked people to select their top 3 kind of categories that we divided the criteria into 15 categories, and we asked participants to select their top 3, which are shown on the chart, with the blue being kind of their first choice, the orange being their second choice, and that tannish color being their third choice. And we found that promoting equitable transportation mobility got the most first choice rankings, as well as just overall was the most commonly selected criteria. Other highly ranked ones included improving pedestrian safety, maintaining the transit system, prioritizing buses, and increasing access to jobs and services. In addition to those focus groups, we also distributed a survey through our usual online channels, emails, Twitter, and the like. And we got 461 responses from folks with a variety of backgrounds. The survey asked respondents to again select 5 criteria that were most important to them out of those 15 that we had also asked the focus group to select from. And we again found promoting more equitable transportation mobility was very high on the list, rating second behind improving pedestrian safety. Also highly rated was reducing emissions and pollution, improving bicycle safety, and reducing congestions. So the result from the survey and the focus group really suggested to us that the MPO should consider weighing equity more heavily than it does currently, as it's consistently emerged as one of the top priorities in that outreach that we've done. But currently it's only gets 12 out of the possible 134 points in our tip scoring criteria. If you want to dive more deeply into these results, my colleague, Kate White, who runs our outreach program, has written a really thorough and engaging memo about the outreach, and you can find that on our website at the MPO calendar under the June 26th MPO meeting.
Betsy, we have a question from John.
Yep.
I have an example of the heat map. I don't have an example of violent plots.
Thanks, Betsy. Again, hello? Betsy?
Yep.
Okay. In this public survey, somebody's talking in the background, I think. I can, the public survey, can you break that into any sub-segments? For instance, those that were in the equity population and what their scores were versus at large of the survey?
We can. I believe that was broken down in the memo. I know that Kate broke it out by population, like in terms of the respondents. I know that we were underrepresented in some of the populations, and I don't want to necessarily quote it because I don't want to quote it wrong.
Right.
I think I want to say income we were underrepresented there,
Yeah.
in terms of low income. But I can't remember if she did cross tab that with the actual result, like the actual priorities. So I'd have to go back and check. But I would definitely check out that memo if you want to see that.
Well, I think that would be an important thing, again, given their topic, just to really see what is most important to them in that group versus at large, and because it would seem as though they need the most compensation, let's say, versus where things have been.
That's a really good point. I can definitely go check that out.
Please, thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. Yeah, and then we're going to be going back to a lot of the same groups that we talked to last fall and winter to get their feedback on our proposed criteria. And So starting in July and going through August. And we'll be sending out a survey as well. So if you see that survey and if you get a link to it, it would be great if you could send it out to your own organizations. I mean, certainly during the time of coronavirus, we really do depend on our partners to kind of help spread the word on this critical work. So keep your eye on that. So, okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what the proposal actually is. And I'm certainly hoping for your feedback and, do you like it, do you not like it, or things you might want to change, what you like about it or not like about it. So it's open to change, it's at a proposal stage right now, so it's not set in stone. But as you saw on the previous slide, the equity criteria are part of a standalone goal area. And one of the biggest changes we're proposing for equity is to integrate it throughout all of the other 5 goal areas and award projects for their benefits relative to the other criteria. So it wouldn't have its own standalone goal area criteria anymore. It would be part of the other goal areas. And to do that, we want to develop what we're calling an equity multiplier based on the people who we anticipate going to be affected by the criteria. So that's kind of a high level overview of our intention, and let me walk you through how that would work. So the proposal consists of 2 parallel processes. One is to evaluate the criteria in each goal area that we choose to be quote unquote equity criteria. For example, we might choose within the safety goal area, improves pedestrian safety. And we would evaluate the projects as we normally do and come up with the base score. Now the second process, and this is what's new, is that we would identify the share of each of the 6 equity populations that live within the project area that would be affected by the project. The outcome being that equity multiplier, which would be multiplied, as you might imagine, by the base score to come up with a final score for that criteria. And we think this approach is going to help us meet our goals of giving all projects an opportunity to get at least some equity points, because we know that equity populations live all throughout our region. They're not limited to one town or another. And this would help us more strongly reward projects that significantly benefit equity populations, while more strongly penalizing those that would create harmful impacts. So I want to move into those 3 goal areas that I mentioned at the outset that we've had the opportunity to present on to the MPO and to kind of show you which impacts we propose applying this multiplier to. And those goal areas are safety, system preservation, and clean air and sustainable communities. So Matt Genova presented these proposed changes at the previous meetings and on the July 16th meeting, MPO meetings. He'll present capacity management and mobility recommendations. And at the August 6th MPO meeting, he will present economic vitality recommendations. So I can't speak in detail about those goal areas yet, but you'll be able to see those recommendations once they're presented to the MPO board. So as I said, we're going to choose a subset of the criteria to evaluate for impacts. And we really wanted to focus on those impacts that would most directly affect equity populations. We're not choosing all of the criteria. I think that would kind of dilute the purpose of this. And this, by doing a few criteria, we can really focus on those existing inequities that we know are the most harmful right now in our region. So under safety, we propose to apply this multiplier to the crash severity value criteria, the improves bicycle safety criteria, and the improves pedestrian safety criteria. And we chose those criteria for several reasons. In the long-range transportation plan needs assessment that we did a few years ago, we found that pedestrian and bicyclist crash clusters are overrepresented in communities with high shares of equity populations. And then in our outreach for the TIP last fall, a lot of respondents emphasized the need to address pedestrian and bicyclist safety as a way of promoting equitable mobility and improving safety in equity communities that are disproportionately affected by severe crashes. Under the system preservation and modernization criteria or goal area, we propose to apply the multiplier to the 4 criteria highlighted or surrounded by that brown box. And those criteria are improves transit assets, incorporates resiliency elements into project design, improves emergency response, and improves substandard sidewalks and paths. And again, we focused on these criteria because those were needs identified in the long-range plan needs assessment, through public outreach and data analysis. And we also heard for outreach for the TIP last fall in particular about the need for improved transit infrastructure, especially around bus infrastructure, bus stops and facilities and the like, as well as the need for more and improved accessible sidewalks. Our final goal area for the day is clean air and sustainable communities. And for this goal area, we propose to apply the multiplier to the reduces other transportation related emissions. Once again, we heard in our needs assessment that reducing emissions is very important for a couple of reasons. One is that some populations, in particular the elderly, young children, and people who have some types of disabilities, are very susceptible to the health impacts of carbon monoxide and of VOCs and particulate matter. We also know from a lot of data analysis that low income and populations and people of color disproportionately located near high volume traffic roadways, which have, of course, then a high amount of emissions, particularly those that carry trucks, where they have a lot of particulate matter being kind of released throughout the day, and that means that those populations are disproportionately affected by air quality problems and emissions in our region. So I know that's a lot to take in, so I'll pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions or comments before I go into how we apply the scoring proposal.
We have Mr. Rieker, I'm unmuting him.
With a, defined by.
So one question about the safety metrics. I see that the safety metrics, one of the first one was the EPDO crash frequency. I know in Cambridge, we actually are one of the cities that do Vision Zero, and our look is clearly focused on reducing fatalities to zero and reducing the severity of crashes. And so we've kind of done away with the EPDO dollar metric. And I'm wondering if you all had considered, in lieu of the EPDO, just focusing on fatalities and severe crashes as maybe the first way to really take a cut at this, because I think EPDO is something that I don't know if a lot of municipalities use. I do know MPOs and state agencies do tend to use that because of the highway safety manuals, but it's definitely something that's not very common on a municipal level.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not totally up on my my safety and crash measurement as some other folks are in my agency, but I know that's something we talked a lot about when we were talking about safety, is moving away from is a severity versus frequency of crash issue. And I wondered if Matt Genova would like to speak a little bit more to that, since he has been the leader in making these criteria changes.
If you raise your hand, Matt, that will help.
The question is, like, well, how do
okay, I think, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it's a good question. It's definitely something that came up in the MPO meeting as well. And so one of the ways that we're changing EPDO for this year is that we are adjusting the scale that we use to calculate the EPDO value to match MassDOT's new scale, which much more heavily weights crashes that result in injuries or fatalities. And so in determining the base EPDO scale, the old scale that we used, which is the same scale that MassDOT used, awarded 1 point for a crash that was a property damage only crash, 5 points for any crashes that resulted in injuries, and then 10 points for any crashes that resulted in a fatality. The new scale still awards 1 point for crashes that result in just property damage, but awards 21 points apiece for crashes that result in either injuries or fatalities. And so that much more heavily weights those crashes that are, more severe. And obviously, the places where we really want to focus our investments. And so we think that the new scale helps us focus more on those serious crashes, but still keeps us sort of aligned with state policy and procedures on this. Yeah, because we got that feedback quite a bit that we need to focus on the more severe crashes. So the hope is that this takes us closer to that direction.
Okay, we have okay, I think John's unmuted. Great, thanks.
All set? Let's see. Okay. A question on the crashing. Could those be examined on a locational basis, for instance, near MBTA bus stops or stations? And that might kind of link to mobility as well, freedom, fluidity, and safety around mobility hubs, let's say, given that a bus stop might be considered a mobility hub.
Yeah, that's actually, I don't think I've heard that brought up before, which is I think, really interesting, good point. Matt, do you want to say anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree that it's also a really interesting point and not something that I think I've heard raised directly either. I mean, we do, so right now the scoring doesn't specifically award, at least the safety scoring doesn't specifically award extra points for being near like a transit station or some other mobility hub. But if projects were investing in those areas, then they would score points sort of in other parts of the criteria. But it wouldn't be directly tied to safety. One of the ways that we do recognize like specific geographies in safety is through looking at crash clusters. And so those, tend to be in places where lots of different modes are interacting. And, obviously those are places where there are just higher numbers of crashes concentrated in a small geography. And so that's where we really bring those more pinpointed geographies into the calculation, is in awarding bonus points for projects that address crash clusters.
Yeah, I think if you were able to identify crash clusters around bus stops, for instance, given that the populations have less options, they are more reliant upon buses, let's say, transit for their mobility, might be able to get a finer grain look at what's needed to address that community.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback, and definitely something we can look into more.
Thank you.
So thank you.
So, folks, I just want to say that this is mostly for you all to ask questions. I've heard a lot of this already at the board meetings, and I'm going to do a focus group later this week. I just want to step back and hear what members of RTAC have to say, think, ask, whatever.
Any other questions before I move on?
Guess not.
Okay, those are really good questions, by the way. So thank you for those. So I'm going to show you how we would evaluate projects with this new proposal. It consists of 2 steps, the first of which is called creating an equity index. And this index is a way to combine the population of each equity demographic into one number that tells us how concentrated they are within that project area. And the higher the indexes, basically, the more equity populations could potentially be affected by the project. And I do want to acknowledge that this is a proximity component. You know, we've touched on that earlier. You know, short of being able to identify exactly who's using what facilities, which we don't have that capability yet. This is kind of the second best option. It would be great, and I think we may, I mean, we're certainly exploring tools to be able to do so. But in case you're wondering, no, our travel demand model is a little bit too, not fine-grained enough and is too expensive to run to be able to do something like that. But that certainly would be the ideal if we can get there. So the index is based on the idea that each population has different distribution characteristics in the region. This goes back to some of the earlier questions from Andy and John, I think, about the distribution of where different populations live. So I'm going to show you the distribution with using maps for all 6 of our populations, starting with the minority population. On the screen, you can see where the red areas have a higher share of people of color within those geographies, whereas the yellow has a lower share. You can see they're very much concentrated in urban areas in the inner core, and then North Shore a little bit of the South Shore, and around Metro West. The low income population shows a sort of a similar distribution pattern, with low income populations predominantly living more in the urban core, North Shore, South Shore, and the Framingham area. But again, I want to emphasize, and this is what one of the goals of our new criteria was, that people live everywhere. So, and some projects just weren't getting any equity points at all in the past. So we want to make sure to recognize the fact that people do live everywhere. Low-income populations, as we know, live in every town in our region, and we need to make sure that we are providing for those populations regardless of where they live geographically. This map shows the distribution for people with limited English proficiency. Again, the story is pretty similar. Higher shares kind of in the inner core and the North Shore, and also out toward the Metro West area. These next 3 populations show quite a different distribution pattern, as you actually probably might expect. Elderly population is more widely distributed. You can see reds and yellows and oranges throughout all of our subregions in our MPO region. The same is sort of true with the youth population, although you can kind of see that not as many young folks living in Boston and the surrounding communities. By that I mean under 18, so kids, and more higher populations further out in the rest of the region. And then finally, people with disabilities is kind of somewhere in between the extremes, fairly well distributed throughout our communities in our region. So with that information in hand, I want to show you how we're going to use that to create the equity index. And I'll use the minority population as an example. This chart shows the distribution of the minority population in graph form. So taking that map and throwing it on a chart. And the distribution, of course, is going to look different for each population group. The y-axis shows the number of transportation analysis zones, while the x-axis shows the percent of the minority population within those zones. And this red dot, there's the red dotted line that shows the average for the region. So there are a few TASs with, there are a few TASs with a high share of minority population. And that's on the far right-hand side of the graph, right? So you'd see a similar kind of visualization of the visual chart, the same kind of pattern with any demographic group whose population is largely concentrated in a smaller region. So we'd see a similar pattern for low-income population and for people with limited English proficiency. So what we did was take this data and divide it into 4 parts based on how many standard deviations above or below the region-wide average is in the project area, and assign the value of 1 through 4. I don't know if you remember standard deviations from your statistics class, but basically the idea is that we want a standardized way of determining when a % of a particular population is very much above the average or very much below the average. And so, for example, the 4 means that the population in the project area, say 80%, is very much above the average for the region of 28.2%. And we want to recognize that by kind of assigning it a higher value. And if you're curious, that means that it's greater than 1.5 standard deviations above the average, above the mean. But the takeaway really is that we're just trying to find a standard way of determining when the share of the equity population in the project area is significantly above or below average. And this process we would do for all 6 of the equity populations. So this is just the minority population. What we then want to do is weight each of the populations in the index. And this is where there is confusion in the MPO group, for the MPO members. I understand if there's a lot of questions, you can feel free to ask away in a moment. But basically what we're doing is taking the base index points, those 1 through 4 values in that middle column, and multiplying it by a population weight that we are coming up with. And that population weight reflects the strong federal protections on certain populations, namely the minority, low income, and people with limited English proficiency populations, and also reflecting the fact of historical discrimination has led these populations to be underserved significantly by the transportation system. So we want to recognize that in our index and weigh the populations appropriately. And those are something that we came up with and are not, federal or anything. They're something that we can change, and but we feel that we need to have something that reflects those issues. And so what we want to do is multiply the base index point by the population weight for the maximum index point for each population group, and add those all up, and a project can get a maximum of 22 for that index. So basically, to summarize, what that shows is that if a project has a 22 for its index, it means it has a very high share of each of the 6 equity populations relative to the average in the region. That's basically all it is, to sum it up. So I'll pause there again, so I see people raise their hands.
Sorry to jump in here, Len. I do see we have some questions. Anna Christina?
Hello. I just had a quick question. I don't want to take you off on a tangent, but this is something that has come up recently for me for the international sustainability standards. And they're trying to incentivize developers, especially any project, to kind of make a preservation of the neighborhood as far as equity by offering training and a promise to employ the neighborhood residents themselves. That way we keep the neighborhood kind of together, and it's a full equity issue. And it's usually, it happens in the construction phase, but they have to submit it as a promise in the planning phase. Would that be some way you can increase the score, or do you see yourself incorporating that at some point? Something like that?
Score is tied largely to federal identification, populations that are defined in federal civil rights laws and executive orders. that being said, we do have some latitude in terms of like these criteria are not required for the tip. In terms of having equity criteria, it's something that we're allowed to do. But in terms of like the how we identify equity populations, that's very much tied to those federal regulations. And Christine, did you want to add something? I think you're muted.
There we go.
There you
okay. Go. Yeah, no, I forgot what I was gonna say. I think this was to keep the neighborhood together, because they're finding with a lot of these equity projects or people that go in and try to score higher in this division, oftentimes after the neighborhood gets broken apart. So this was something that needs to come in the planning phases, is promise to try and employ, no matter what the population is, whether it's disabled or minority or young or old or anything like that, including not just construction type jobs, but maybe some permanent positions like monitoring, especially for pollution, stuff like that afterwards. It's kind of, you see the benefit afterwards, because a lot of these projects, they literally break a neighborhood apart. I mean, they're built with good intentions, but then the real estate value goes up and the original people that it was supposed to benefit don't see the benefit. They just move to the next place that needs benefits. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, sorry, I think I understand your question better. Yeah, we don't have any direct control over who's employed in any part of the planning construction funding phases at all. I mean, beyond obviously whoever works at CTPS, we hire. I think it sounds what you're getting at is a gentrification issue, and that is definitely an issue. I mean, that's huge, and it's tough because, and it's very important, but it's really tough as an MPO where our mission is so narrow in that regard, and the gentrification has housing issues and land use and community development and transportation and all these kind of factors that mix together to affect who lives there and who can stay, who moves in. It's something we've heard a lot about, and I think I don't think it's something we're ready to kind of incorporate right now into the TIP criteria, but I think it's something that we need to continue to think about how we can best address it, with the tools that we have, because it's tough. It's a really hard issue, and I don't think we can do it alone. I think it's something that we would need to have more partnership with other agencies that deal with kind of those other components of gentrification beyond transportation.
Yeah, I think that's why they're trying to, for like any given project, like whether it's a complete streets or road improvement, anything like that, they're trying to incentivize the contractors to come in during these planning phases and promise, but it's got to be monitored. So I understand it's difficult. Anyway, I didn't want to take you off on a tangent. Thank you for that.
No, that's a really good issue to bring up, and I'm glad you did.
What you're actually looking at is,
so go ahead, Betsy. I'm not sure if Matt wants to say something after you. So you finish your thought, and then if Matt wants to jump in, he can jump in.
I was just going to say that we are proposing a certain amount, trying to find a way to integrate public engagement or like measuring public outreach in our criteria, not in the not in the criteria that I've mentioned, but that's something that we've brought up in economic vitality goal area, or we will bring up. So I think that's and maybe that would help too, to be able to measure and evaluate projects based on the strength of their public outreach.
Okay. Well, this is really helpful. Thank you for
yeah, and Len, thanks for the opportunity to jump in really quickly. Just add sort of one more element onto Betsy's answer. I think that's the difficult part about where we sit as the MPO is that we are funding projects, but we don't oversee the contracting process for these projects. Like that happens through MassDOT at the state level. And, there are sort of set rules around how they how they conduct the bid and offer process, and how they choose a winning bid to actually pursue a contract with. And so I think that would be like a really great place to address this sort of issue is, like if at the state level, there were some sort of standards around, inclusion in labor in terms of the contracts, whether that's, sourcing labor for the project itself, sourcing materials from, minority or women-owned businesses, et cetera. Like, I think those are all like really compelling ideas and certainly something that would be great to see. But I think just at the MPO level, we don't really have the ability to sort of pull that lever, because once we commit funding to a project, it's a little bit out of our hands, and really even sort of out of the municipality's hands, because there is sort of a standard contracting process that all the projects end up having to go through.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So next we have Franny.
Oh, mine is even more of a tangent. It's actually just, I just wanted to ask you, like, I'm on the Commission on Disabilities in my town, and we always have trouble in getting a handle on how many people there are with disabilities. So I'm just sort of curious, how do you get that data? What data is it that you use when you say how many people have disabilities in a certain town, and what kind of disabilities are those?
We get it from the American Community Survey, which is done every year by the US Census Bureau. They have a website that you can download the data directly from, specify your town, and whatever geography you'd like. And again, the key with that, the challenge with that always is that it is an estimate. I was talking about before that it's self-reported, so it's an estimate of who's
right.
That. And in terms of the types of disabilities, they have 6 different types. I don't remember them all, but it's something like cognitive, I think emotional is one, physical, audio, visual. So that they divide it up too, so you can get the data on like the types of disabilities as well as the total number of people with disabilities.
I think something that has to be looked at is as people age, people in terms of transportation, many people stop driving at night. That wouldn't show up on a disability thing. Things like that, or even just stopping driving. Somebody in their 80s who just decided to stop driving. Anyway, I just think maybe we should think about exploring those details sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at how many people who are elderly and have a disability. So you can do like the multiple factor analysis, which actually I'll get to in a little bit too. Is something that Len had brought up at one of our meetings, or someone, Sheila, I can't remember. What happens when one person kind of inhabits multiple demographic groups, right? And how does that affect their transportation need and vulnerability?
Good point.
All right, we have John next.
Thank you. Just to get back to Anna Christina's, the Boston Planning and Development Group does try and secure from developers minority participations and things like that. And I think it's been a little squishy as to whether or not they've really delivered it in the final analysis on a particular project, but that would be a place to perhaps start. But I think they only use minority businesses, loosely defined, and female-owned businesses. So anyway, that's just a case in point. Number one, I guess I would go back to one of your chart where you went through the various levels that led up to 22 in your index. Yeah, that one. I guess I would have some issue with the low-income population getting a maximum of 4 points. Again, it would seem as though the low-income factor is a real driver for needs for mobility that are underserved and are clustered in areas that need more access. So I guess I would personally lobby that it gets a maximum of 8 as opposed to that. I think it's undervalued. And one other aspect, going a little bit farther back in terms of your identification of groups, and you might go to the state's data-driven source of the issuance of EBT cards or mass health and things like that in terms of the clusters, and apply that to your census blocks as well, is another confirming factor of where there's an income insufficiency and a dependency on various other factors. So, and in terms of the previous slide to this one, if you could flip back one slide. The line that's your 28.2, do you have an example of an area that that would apply to, or a project that that would apply to?
So most projects, I don't remember the projects that I scored last winter. Most projects don't exceed that threshold, because if you, well, see in the graph that only a few areas, a few TASs or transportation analysis zones have a high share of minority population. So like you can visually kind of see that in the map.
Right.
So not many so something like McGrath Highway would have, I think, got over 28.2. If you remember, McGrath goes through Somerville. But yeah, most projects don't even get points for equity population because, and the same for low income, because of how the population is distributed in our region.
Okay, I guess I would go back to that first point, which is the undervalue perhaps of the income factor from where it's 4 as a max, and I would lobby for 8.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I note that down, and we'll go back and look at it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next we have Ellen. And I don't recognize Ellen, so if you can tell us who you are.
Great. Yes, hi. My name is Ellen Lee, and I'm with the Greater Boston chapter of United Spinal, and I also volunteer with Arlington's Commission on Disability. And I just wanted to backtrack a little to follow up on the person who made the excellent point about the elderly in terms of, you know, not being represented, that, you know, often people will stop driving at night or just stop driving altogether. And someone mentioned about, you know, including elderly with disabilities, but one of the issues is that oftentimes people in the elderly population may have a disability, would be considered a person with a disability, but they don't necessarily identify themselves as somebody with a disability. So even though they would, you know, technically meet the criteria of being somebody with a disability, and so they may not identify as much or report themselves or see themselves as being a person with disability. So I think it's just important to, you know, keep that in mind.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. That's a really good point. I know certainly that's an issue with any data set from the census, is data being underreported. Mm-hmm. And you know, we've been exploring other ways to get at some of those get data that represent more fully the number of people who fall into these demographic groups. And we can't replace the census, unfortunately, fully because of federal requirements. But in terms of where we can supplement it, I think that's really helpful for us. And if you or anyone else have better data sources or alternative data sources, you know, let me know and I can look into that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So how much more time do you want, Betsy?
Where am I? Probably 15 minutes, maybe.
Okay. That will push us over, but that's fine. I mean, no, that's fine. I mean, so no, it's not your fault, because we encourage people to ask questions, but now we're gonna not encourage people so much to ask questions. I mean,
maybe not that long, maybe 10 minutes.
Okay, until you have finished up, I mean, and then we'll see how much time we have, and then determine, you know, how many questions we can handle, and maybe how we can continue to discuss this conversation after this meeting. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so we've gone through bulk of the hard stuff. So this is more to show you how we're scoring projects now than anything else. So kind of this final step is to take the index that we've found for each project and assign it an equity multiplier. And this is really where that weighting question comes in that I brought up at the beginning of how strongly do we want to weight equity against the other goal areas. I have to admit that I kind of somewhat randomly assigned equity multipliers based on what seemed reasonable when I was testing the scoring process on existing projects. So I divided the equity indexes into 4 groups, basically separating it by groups of 5, and assign equity multipliers that would be applied to those impacts that we choose to apply it to, from 1.25 up to 2. But we can change that, and certainly that's kind of one of the key areas I would encourage folks to think about when you're thinking about, well, where can I best provide feedback is along that, for the equity multiplier. And we'll be doing, as I said, doing some test scoring to see how it works out, kind of within the context of all the other new criteria, and we'll kind of come back and see if our thoughts made sense. In terms of how those multipliers would have been distributed for projects funded in fiscal years 2017 to 21. Most of the equity multipliers are in that 1.5 range, which means the index is between 6 and 10, out of a total, again, of 22, and a few outliers, which you would kind of expect. I think there to be kind of a cluster around a particular, around the average, but that's where it comes out now. So to summarize the scoring process, I just want to show you a hypothetical project using the safety criteria and how the score would play out. We would have our base score here, score each criteria as usual, and then these highlighted in orange criteria we want to apply the multiplier to. Just say for sake of argument it's 1.5. We get our final score. And for this project, the score would have gone up from 9 to 12.5. So a bit of an increase. So to really summarize and wrap up, I just want to mention some of the feedback that I've received from the MPO, and I think you'll recognize some of this as things that you've also been mentioning today. These comments have really focused around 2 main areas of interest regarding potential adjustments to these criteria. First, folks have suggested that the criteria should address the fact that different demographic groups may benefit differently from different types of transportation improvements. For example, low-income populations without access to a car really may not benefit from roadway projects. Of course, not all low-income people rely, or people with low incomes rely on public transit. So what I've been doing is looking at the intersection between different populations to better understand their transportation needs and levels of vulnerability to changes in the transportation system. Now, what I found so far is that there is a big overlap between low-income and minority populations, and more than you would expect based on their average in the region. And there's also significant overlap between people who don't have access to a car and people with low incomes, as well as people without access to a car and minority populations. So that gives you an idea that populations with particular indicators and having multiple demographic indicators suggest that they are particularly vulnerable to being underserved and potentially not being having access to the transportation that they need to live their lives fully. So secondly, there is a suggestion from MPO members that the criteria should more strongly suggest existing inequities in the transportation system. By identifying and really pulling out those criteria that we know to be, and possibly more heavily weighting them, that we know to be more really critical, and where those populations are disproportionately adversely affected or not benefiting enough relative to non-equity populations. So we know that transportation investments really have not been equitable for a lot of populations, leading to adverse impacts that affect disproportionately people of color and people with low incomes in particular. Certainly it's been brought to the fore a lot recently Although that's always been a problem, just because it's being talked about now doesn't mean it hasn't been systemic throughout our transportation system in the past many, many decades. And these impacts include longer travel times, greater exposure to auto emissions, as I mentioned earlier, less access to the transit system, and many others as well. So given that feedback, I am also working on exploring ways that we can address those concerns and questions in the criteria. And I encourage you to think about those as well. If you have any feedback or questions about those recommendations, I am happy to hear that. Now, to really wrap up, I just want to fill you guys in on our next steps. Today, obviously, I'm talking with you guys about the equity criteria. Matt and I will be kind of co-presenting on the capacity management goal area at the July 16th meeting. So that's the big one. That's where a lot of the criteria are. So that will be an interesting discussion for sure. And then on August 6th, we'll also be presenting at the MPO meeting about the economic vitality goal area criteria. And after that, in August and through September, we're going to be discussing and test scoring results that we're going to be starting to work on soon, and sharing those results and workshopping basically in an iterative fashion the results of using these proposed criteria on existing projects. So that's all that I have. I'm happy to take any more questions or feedback that you guys have.
Well, thanks, Betsy. And so we'll entertain 5 more minutes of questions, but I want to find out from you, when do you think will be the best time for you to come back and talk with us?
I think it'd be really great to discuss rescoring with you guys. I think you're going to probably find that very interesting. We don't quite know how that's going to pan out yet, so we haven't been able to put all the criteria together in one shot. So maybe that's a good place to do it. And Matt Genova, if you also have any thoughts, jump in if you like.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I agree with Betsy that I think the rescoring will be a really interesting conversation. I think we'll start to have a first draft of that in late August. So perhaps early September, if that's, if there's an RTAC meeting around that time, then that might be a good opportunity to come back and talk about where things stand.
Look, I'm sorry for the background noise here. That's me, that when I talk, we have another conversation going on, so I'm sorry about that. And it's okay, September. That's really what I wanted to know. So we'll reserve space for you at the September RTAC meeting. So great. So once again, folks, any more questions?
Yeah.
Well, I have some, but I'm going to save them for Friday. And, so
I'll be ready for you.
No problem. So great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, Betsy and Matt. And as always, this is very helpful. And the goal, of course, is to make sure that the advisory council has as much input into this process as we want, because the criteria are really important when it comes to determining how projects get into the universe, and not so much whether a project gets into the universe, but the score that it comes into the universe with, which has a big impact on how we give it consideration. So thanks again. Moving on, I guess the next is the chair's report. I'm not looking at the agenda. Are you, Mr. Archer?
Yep, I just need to do something slightly awkward to get back to the agenda, so I apologize, folks. This is going to look a little strange on the screen.
I can scroll back to it. It's just that I was trying to do my talking in real time so I could mute myself when it gets a little noisy here. Well, let's just go with the chairs.
Yeah, go for it.
And then we'll discuss new business, old business. As Betsy had mentioned, Kate White had given a presentation on the survey, and it was very good. So I recommend that you go to the agenda for the previous MPO meeting, which I think was the 25th, the last MPO meeting in June. and you'll find Kate White's presentation there. It gives you a nice breakdown. And as you know, Kate is always happy to be available to people. So if you have questions, you can follow up with her by email independently of a meeting. But we may be doing something with Kate formally sooner rather than later. The other thing that was in that meeting that was very interesting was a continuing discussion about the what's going to be, how are we going to define a major infrastructure project, and to recap a bit. We had the situation where some projects that were initially labeled as complete street projects went above the threshold for the cost that would put them into the major infrastructure category. And when we did that, then the proportion of major infrastructure projects became higher than what's the goal for the MPO. So the question is, what do we do about projects that go up in cost and then potentially put them into the category of major infrastructure? And that looked like it was a fairly straightforward conversation, from the meeting before that led to the previous meeting on that. But it got really complicated in the last meeting, so that conversation is going to go on. It was more so a matter of there is a certain category of project. I think it's some intersection projects, major intersection projects. We removed that category from the LRTP, but those cost a lot, and so the question is, do we want to consider those major infrastructure projects, or how do we deal with them? And I'm sorry if I'm not being clear about that part of the conversation, but it was complex and a little bit confusing. And at this point, I'm sure the audio is out there, and you can go back and listen to it, and eventually the minutes will be clear, will be published, and eventually I'll be really clear on the concept and can report back to you at a subsequent meeting. So that's it in terms of my chair's report. So in terms of old business and new business, essentially what I really want to find out from the members is whether you would like to have another one of those like bonus meetings in a couple of weeks. A couple of topics that come to mind are the pedestrian report card. There was a presentation on that probably about 5 or 6 months ago that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to have that person come and present to RTAC about it. Another topic would be the scenario planning and modeling around that. I forget the gentleman's name, but he came to talk to the MPO, and I thought it'd be good to the board, and I thought it'd be good to have him come and talk more with us about that, since that was something that we had recommended for the MPO to pursue in the next cycle of the LRTP, and we're starting to work on that next cycle now, and then a couple other topics. And actually, Mr. Reeker had brought this up as a suggestion, and that is that we could get some information about from TPS about the work plans for the two standard big ticket or highly funded projects in the UPWP. I think they revolve around, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. I'm going to unmute. Excuse me. I'm going to unmute Andy so that he can tell me himself. Matt, can you help me out here because I'm not seeing participants?
Sure, I can unmute. You're not seeing? Okay. If you go, I unmuted Andy for now. I'll send you a chat message.
Yeah, I think given the conversation about the UPWP, I think there's definitely an interest in getting a better understanding of how the two larger corridor safety analysis projects within the UPWP, how they work, and how open they are to hearing input and feedback. And definitely, I think that's selected corridors from the long-range transportation plan, and then I think an additional safety-related corridor analysis for some sub-regional roadways. And so I think definitely from my perspective in Cambridge, I don't think we have a lot in there, but I think I'm just curious to understand how, those roadways are selected and kind of the ability for not just public officials or advocates, but, even people kind of, within those communities being able to advocate for taking a look at those roadways, because they are usually very important roadways in important neighborhoods that may not have been well served in the past. So.
And was there something else that you suggested, Andy?
I don't think so, but okay. It's been a month, and right. It's been quite a month, so I don't remember anything.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So if you all have a preference, then now would be the time to speak up. Actually, I see Laura wants to say something. Laura?
I'm muting. Yeah. I was wondering what the pedestrian report card is or would be. That sounds like potentially interesting, but I don't know what exactly that is.
Matt, can you give me more detail on that?
On this, and
I'm sorry, I'm having sort of a technical breakdown on my end right now.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Well, it's essentially what it sounds like, Laura. They pretty much give an assessment of the sidewalks and places that pedestrians either use or would want to use. I'm not doing a very good job, but it's a fairly extensive, or let me rephrase this. It's a fairly ambitious project, and I thought the presentation was interesting. That said, I know it sounds ironic that I find it interesting and have a hard time telling you about it, but it was a while ago. I think it was like February, January, and I did interact a whole lot because I was thinking it'd be really good to have a longer conversation with the person.
So was it a like presentation about a tool to evaluate crosswalks? Is that what it is?
It's more than that, but I think that's partly it. And it's done by one of the subcommittees of the MPO. I think it's like the congestion committee. So it's a major undertaking by the MPO. Look, unless other people really want something else before then, I'm going to push to have that. For this coming meeting, and I can get information before that. Now, if you say you want more information before, to give you even more time, and maybe we do this in August or September, then I can understand that. But I think if I give you like the links to the presentation and then the links to the MPO, to where you can find out more information on MPO, I can do that tomorrow, or let's say Friday. Do you have enough time? Go ahead.
Len, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that Kate White has helpfully shared links to the Pedestrian Report Card Assessment Interactive Database, as well as a blog article explaining the tool. She sent that out in the chat, so hopefully everyone can find that.
Yeah, I saw it. Thank you.
Yep.
Right.
And I will look at that.
Right. So, I see John has his hand up.
One resource that might already exist that could be combined with that report card are walkability scores. They exist for many communities. Almost all of them, I think, have been developed. Sometimes you'll even find them on some of the real estate pages like Zillow and things like that, but those are helpful.
Okay, John, thank you very much. And also thanks to David Montgomery for reminding me about the minutes. So I'm going to break into old business, new business, approve those minutes, then come back to determining whether or not we're going to have a meeting in a couple of weeks, and then what we're going to do about August. So on the minutes, how do people feel about approving them? If you want to motion to approve, now would be a good time to raise your hand. Then we can have a discussion. And then we decide whether or not we're going to approve them. I can't do it because I'm the chair. All right. Well then, you need to raise your hand, in the app, because if you're raising your hand in video, I'm not seeing you. Okay, there we go. Great.
I didn't read them, and so I didn't want to be the one to.
Gotcha. Okay, fine. Understand. That's legit. And all right. Yeah, well, like I said, I can't do it.
Just as a quick reminder, folks, the raise hand function can be found in the participants menu, which you can click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and then the raise hand button is located in the lower right hand corner.
We have Mr. Montgomery.
Yeah, I'm happy to make the motion unless somebody would rather not do it this time. I also appreciate being reminded how to raise my hand because I was not finding it. So thank you.
I'm fine. I'm fine seconding it even.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, David. And I just have the video minimized on my screen so I can see the rest of what's going on.
So moved by David, seconded by Franny.
That would be what I would say. So thank you for saying that, Franny. And we're open for discussion. Seeing no discussion, we will vote on this. And I just can't bring myself to do a whole queue. So I'm going to shortcut this and say that if you do not want to approve them, raise your hand. And maybe I can set myself up so I can see everything. I'm not seeing any hands raised. So it's a minor enough issue that I think we're legit here. And I just want to express my appreciation for the minutes. I know that staff, there's just not enough staff for it. And so thank you very much. And hopefully through the work that we do in talking more about CTPS, we can help with this issue. So now back to discussion. Go ahead.
Wait, Len, I'm sorry. Could people potentially raise their hands if they want to abstain from the vote?
Thank you, Matt.
Yep. Seeing none.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
So back to discussion about whether or not we want to do a meeting in 2 weeks. We'll keep it to like an hour, I guess if the discussion is really interesting, we can go as long as we want, but I'm not going to plan it for more than an hour. So any objections to doing that? It will start next Wednesday, 2:30. We'll record it. And attendance is by no means mandatory. It doesn't count towards whether or not you are a member in good standing. Okay, not seeing any objections. We'll do that pedestrian report card then, and we can discuss when we will do other topics, at other either full advisory council meetings or other bonus meetings. And I see Laura has her hand up.
It's hard to have this discussion when everybody's on mute. Maybe we should unmute when we're talking about something like this. But first I heard you say in 2 weeks, and then I heard you say next week. What is the date you're talking about?
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant 2 weeks. So it'd be 2 weeks from now. And so it'd be
July 22nd?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Matt, Laura's making a good point. And I think it's pretty safe here. Now, is it possible for you to unmute everybody?
So what I can do, I can either unmute everybody, which might result in a lot of background noise, or I can give everybody the ability to unmute themselves.
That's what I meant. Yeah. Give everyone.
All right. So there we go. We'll go ahead and do that right now. So everybody should be able to unmute themselves now.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Matt.
Okay. Yep. So so you're talking about having a meeting in 2 weeks, and probably it will be about the pedestrian report card?
No, it will be.
No.
It will be. No,
it definitely will be.
It definitely will be. So
okay,
yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll put it in my book.
All right. Starting at 2:30, and so the last thing to discuss is whether we have an August meeting, and I'm in favor of doing it, especially since we lost the meeting when we decided not to do so at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm thinking of making it kind of low key where members will go around and do a little more extensive introduction about themselves and their group, and give some input into what you would like to see on the upcoming agendas. It was something actually I wanted to kind of incorporate into all the meetings, but even after a begging for a 15-minute longer meeting, I'm still finding that it's not enough time, and I can't get myself to tack that on to a meeting. So maybe we can just do this all in a fun August RTAC meeting. So Laura, hand up.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to, but okay. But I am on vacation both the 12th and the 19th, so I probably won't be there.
All right.
I just was typing into this. All right, so now I have to take my hand down. Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh no, I didn't see that my hand is up. Okay. Raise hand.
I'm sorry, Laura. I lowered it for you. I didn't mean to confuse matters further.
It's a pain in the neck, isn't it?
It is.
So anyone doesn't want to do this? Sorry, folks, I lost my headphones, so I think I'm back. Someone talk?
You sound like you're back.
Okay, I hear you. So I'm not hearing anyone saying that they don't want to do it, and so alrighty. So we'll do it. It'll be planned for 90 minutes, 105 minutes. I mean, if people have very little to say or very few people show up, then it'll just be a shorter meeting. But I think it'd be nice to get to know each other a little bit better and what our organizations are about and what we want to get out of RTAC going forward, and maybe even some planning for future meetings. So great. I'm looking forward to it, and we'll record it for Laura, and maybe Laura can record a little presentation about herself and what she does, and we can play it during the meeting. Yeah. So,
I'll write you a letter. How about that?
All right, that's fine. Old school. I take it though.
Yes, old school. That's me. Well, okay, I'll write you an email.
All right. So great.
Medium school.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's it for me. Anything from anyone else? Franny, I have the whole Brady bunch for you now, so I can see everyone. No. All right.
I was just waving goodbye.
All righty. Well, thanks, folks. It was fun. And thanks again to our guest. And so I guess we'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Someone seconds? Second. Without any objection, we're going to end this party